Hello everyone, now let us discuss about comparison of European and US approval processes for drugs and devices. Now coming to the regulation of DADs. DAD is nothing but development and dissemination of medical drugs and devices. The regulation of DADs involves competing interest, ensuring that agents that are both safe and effective while facilitating the movement of innovative therapies as rapidly as possible through the investigative process to the public use. The regulation mainly deals with it ensures that the agents must be safe and effective. At the same time, it facilitates the movement of innovative therapies as rapidly as possible through the investigative process in order to make that particular product for public use. The controversy persists about the time differences between the US and EU regulatory processes, cost, and the time that it takes for a DAD to proceed from the concept to approval under the regulations of each. And the frequently held assertion is that slower FDA approval process deprives the American citizens of effective DADs that are available to Europeans. And the critics have characterized that FDA process as slow, risk-averse, and expensive. The FDA was an outgrowth of the division of US Patent Office in the mid-19th century. Initially, charged with ensuring that medications on the public market were effective as advertised. The Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act of 1938 subsequently invested that the agency with more rigorous powers to ensure that the drugs were not only effective but safe. And the FDA was ultimately given the authority to regulate the medicinal devices in the 1976 through legislation that was later amended in the Medical Device User Fee and Modernization Act of 2002. Although regulatory amendments have been implemented to facilitate the DAD transit from concept to market, the powers and processes of the FDA had stayed largely consistent since the 1970s and are authoritative for all 50 states. And the evolution of European regulation of DADs, by contrast, is much more recent with significant changes after the formation of EU in 1993. Before that, regulation and marketing approval for DAD fell to its own member states. And difference in regulations among the states often impeded the marketing and disbursement of DADs across the Europe, and in some cases fostered the protectionist legislation within the state to shield sovereign nations companies from fierce marketing competition. Among the current 28 member states, many interstate agencies have been reorganized, and clinical trial applications are generally handled in the member state, whereas marketing applications are approved by both state and central agencies in accordance with regulations set forth by the EC. Coming to the European regulation of drugs, efforts to standardize European regulations regarding the drug approval first came to fruition before the formation of EU with the passage of EC Directive 65/65 by EEC in 1965. And the directive defines a medical product. That directive defines a medical product as any substance or combination of substances which may be administered to human beings or animals with the view to making a medical diagnosis or restoring, correcting, or modifying the physiological function in the human beings or in animals. And under that directive, any medicinal product marketed in the member states would first pass approval in the originating state. And this directive established consistent guidelines throughout the member states regarding the information that must be submitted for the approval. These items parallel regulation of FDA regarding the investigational new drug applications and new drug approval applications. Coming to the drug approval processes. Many of the processes to approve drugs in EU is similar to those of FDA. An investigator of a proposed pharmaceutical first obtains a pre-authorization. The investigator first obtains a pre-authorization for the use of drug in clinical trials. And all European clinical trials are regulated under the Clinical Trials Directive of the European Commission, later replaced in 2014 by Regulation number 536/2014 of the European Parliament. After the pre-authorization, the drug progresses through the sequential studies analogous to that of the United States. They are phase 1, 2 and 3. Phase 0, 1, 2 and phase 3 studies. The phase 1 trials conducted in small number of healthy subjects to clarify the pharmacology and dose range. Phase 1 trials, they mainly focus on pharmacology and dose range. Phase 2 trials are conducted in several hundred patients with the target condition to investigate dose-response relationship. Phase 2 trials, they focus on dose-response relationship. And finally, phase 3 confirmatory trials in several hundred to thousand patients to substantiate safety and efficacy. The phase 3 mainly focuses on safety and efficacy. Phase 1 focuses on pharmacology and dose range. Phase 2 focuses on dose-response relationship. And phase 3 focuses on safety and efficacy. As in the United States, the EC provides means for approving orphan drugs or the drugs that treat conditions that affect so few people that are randomized controlled trials may be impossible to complete. And there are also other methods for obtaining conditional approval for drugs to be used in medicinal emergency conditions. There are separate guidelines for orphan drugs and for drugs approval of drugs that are used in the emergency conditions. And the European Medicine Agency, EMA, European Medicines Agency, was formed in 1995 with the funding from EU pharmaceutical industry and member states. The EMA was charged with harmonizing process in the member state regulatory agencies to reduce the annual cost to drug companies, as well as to eliminate competition restricting regulation in the sovereign states. However, EMA does not oversee all drug approvals. This is an important point and important difference between EU and US FDA. The European Medicines Agency does not oversee all drug approvals the way FDA does in United States. In Europe, there are 4 routes by which a drug can be approved depending on the drug class and manufacturer preference. The 4 drug approval processes in the EU are centralized process, national process, mutual recognition and decentralized procedure. Coming to centralized process. The centralized process is controlled through the EMA. Every member state of the EU is represented on the EMA committee for medicinal products, which issues a single license valid in all EU member states. This route of approval is mandatory for some classes of drugs, such as treatment for HIV or AIDS, oncology, diabetes, neurodegenerative disorders, autoimmune diseases and viral diseases. These classes of drugs, they must and should undergo a centralized process. The next process is national process. Each EU state can have its own procedures for approving drugs that fall outside those required to undergo centralized process. Next is mutual recognition. The drugs approved in one state via that state's national process can obtain marketing authorization in another member state. That is mutual recognition. And finally, decentralized procedure. Here, the manufacturer can apply for simultaneous approval in more than one EU state for products that have not been authorized in any EU state and do not fall under the mandatory centralized process. They should not be authorized in any EU state and should not fall under the mandatory centralized process. In decentralized procedure, manufacturer can apply simultaneous approval in more than one EU state. Now here you can see the comparison of drug approval process in the United States. Whether it is United States or European Union, first application must be submitted to FDA. Application for FDA for permission to conduct clinical trials and transport drug across the state. That must be done in US. When it comes to European Union, application within one or more states of the European Union for approval of conducting clinical studies, and each state designates its own regulatory body that will carry out the approvals. The next is clinical trials phase. The clinical trials phase is similar for United States and European Union. All phase 0 and phase 1 trials, they are performed on small number of healthy subjects to clarify the pharmacology and dose range. Phase 2 trials, they are performed on several hundred patients within the target condition to determine the dose response relationship. And phase 3 trials, they are done on several hundreds to 1,000 patients to show safety and efficacy. This is common for both United States and EU. The next coming for other approval processes for emergency use and orphan drugs. Orphan drug, according to US FDA, orphan drug is a drug that shows promise in treating illness that affects fewer than 2 lakh patients in the United States. That is an orphan drug. And they have special orphan drug applications and special approval processes for them. The next is emergency drug application, EIND. Process for life-threatening situation. Shorter process for IND approval, and full IND approval application process must be initiated, but the treatment can proceed after the EIND approval. The next is treatment IND process. Drug must be in clinical trials and show promise in treating the life-threatening or serious conditions. When it comes to EU, orphan drugs are drugs that treat conditions experienced by less than 50,000 patients annually. 1 to 50,000 patients. Less than or equal to. Next, emergency drug use provided for life-threatening situation. For approval of emergency drugs, the drug must be already engaged in clinical trials. And finally, in US, after this, new drug application is submitted to FDA. And FDA will see all types of drugs are governed or dictated by FDA. But in EU, there are 4 different pathways for drug approval, as we have discussed earlier. The centralized process, national process, mutual recognition, and decentralized process. Now coming to European regulation of devices. The approval process for the medical devices also follows a path of harmonization in Europe with the establishment of EU. But medical device regulation also does not fall solely for any one agency. 3 EC directives that have been subjected to periodic amendment address the approval of medical devices. The first one is implantable devices are regulated under the Directive 90/385/EC, and most other devices are regulated under the Directive 93/42/EC. And finally, in vitro diagnostic devices that is medical devices used on substances produced by the body are regulated under 98/79/EC under Directive 93/42/EC. Under the Directive 93/42/EC, the definition of a medical device is as follows. It is any instrument, apparatus, appliance, material or other article, whether used alone or in combination, including the software necessary for its proper application, intended by the manufacturer to be used for human beings. for the purpose of diagnosis, prevention, monitoring, treatment, or alleviation of the disease. Diagnosis, monitoring, treatment, or alleviation or compensation of an injury or handicap. Investigation, replacement, or modification of any anatomy or physiological process or of a physiological process, and control of consumption which does not achieve its principal intended use in or on human body by pharmacological, immunological, and metabolic means, but which may be assisted in its function by such means. In EU, every marketed medical device must carry a conformity European CE mark, conformity European mark, indicating that it conforms to relevant directives set forth in the EC medical device directives of the EU. A device with EC mark can be marketed in any EU member state, and the medical devices that are non-implantable and considered low risk are self-marked, meaning that the manufacturer itself simply certifies compliance and applies a CE mark. High-risk devices must undergo a more extensive outside review. Though a complex system of registration, high-risk medical devices approval through applications can be filed in any member state and reviewed by a notified body. That is established. NB is nothing but notified body established within that state and authorized by that state's competent authority or health agency to assess and assure conformity with requirement of the relevant EC directive. NBs are private companies. Notified bodies are private companies that contract with manufacturer to supply these certifications for a fee, and there are currently around 76 NBs in the EU. And once the NB agrees that a device meets the requirements for the conformity, NB issues a CE mark, and the device can be marketed in the EU member states. Until recently, EC mark authorization was without further controls and no further evaluation. But new regulations in 2010 tightened requirements for approval of devices based on their similarity to previous predicate devices. And they also require proactive post-marketing surveillance of devices by their manufacturers. The post-marketing surveillance events, for example, alerts, modifications, recalls, and withdrawals of the products are required in the new regulations. They must be reported to the central database, which is nothing but EUDAMED, EUDAMED, EUDAMED. This is a central database to facilitate dissemination of information of adverse events throughout Europe. The database is currently available only to the EC and competent authorities, not to public. But according to Emergo, a global medical device consulting firm, the future EUDAMED steering committee met in the January 2016, discussed the widening of this database accessibility to NBs, manufacturers, experts, non-European competent authorities, medical institutions, public, and the press. Now, comparison of US and the EU device approval. Approval of medical devices in both EU and the United States share certain similarities. FDA assigns devices into three main categories: Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. Class 1 deals with low risk, Class 2 deals with moderate risk, and Class 3 deals with high risk. In the United States, a Class 1 device requires merely a pre-market notification without clinical trials, whereas Class 3 devices require clinical trials and or other evidences unless they are not substantially different from a already marketed Class 3 device. If they are similar to previously approved predicate device. Predicate device is nothing but a previously approved device that is considered as a control. If any new device is similar to previously approved predicate device, they can usually forego the clinical testing or undergo only limited clinical investigations. And about 75% of the Class 2 devices in the United States require some form of the clinical trials to demonstrate their safety and that they perform as expected. Although the level of evidence required for approval is often less rigorous than for a new drug approval. And And usually randomized control trials, for example, are very uncommon because of the difficulties in randomization and blinding. And many devices are approved based upon small observational studies. In Europe, the European Council New Approach Directives define essential requirements that apply to all countries to ensure device safety and performance. And EC assigns devices into four classes. US FDA, it assigns into three classes, whereas EC assigns into four classes. Class 1 or low risk needs only self-declare that they conform with the essential requirements to the national competent authority in their country of origin. And in United Kingdoms, for example, the competent authority is Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, MHRA. And coming to moderate and high risk devices, they require clinical and or non-clinical evidence to support the approval. As in United States, if a device is shown to be substantially similar to an already approved device, data from the predicate device may be used to support the approval and new clinical testing may not be needed. Here is the summary of comparison of device approval process in the United States and EU. Whether it is EU or United States, first of all, they will classify the devices. According to US FDA, they are categorized as Class 1, Class 2 and Class 3. Class 1, low risk, Class 2, intermediate risk and Class 3, high risk. For Class 1, pre-market notification process does not require clinical trials. When it comes to Class 2, 25% does not require clinical trials, whereas 75% require clinical trials. And for Class 3, here the process is more stringent for the Class 3 or high risk devices. Clinical trials are required to show safety and efficacy. For Class 3 devices without predicates, clinical trials are required to show safety and efficacy. And for Class 3 devices, for the reclassification of a device that was automatically classified as a Class 3 device as a Class 2. In this case, less stringent clinical evidence will be generally required. And for Class 3 devices with predicates, if substantial similarity is seen, even for Class 3 devices, no clinical trials are required. And for Class 3 devices without predicates, clinical trials are required to show safety and efficacy. And finally, manufacturer will file application for the FDA approval. This is in US FDA, according to US FDA. Now coming to European Union, it classifies as low risk, Class 1, Class 2A and 2B as intermediate and Class 3 as high risk. For Class 1, self-declare to the competent authority of a state of a EU and then you can market throughout the EU. For Class 2 devices and Class 3 devices with the predicates, whether it is Class 2 or Class 3 with the predicates, if substantial similarity is seen, generally these devices does not require any clinical evidence. And for Class 2A, 2B and 3 devices without predicates, clinical evidence is required to show safety that the device performs as planned. And finally, a decentralized approval process is seen. The application to any of the NBs of any EU state, NB, which is nothing but notified body, it examines the application to assure compliance with the EC regulations, and if the device meets the regulatory requirement, an EC is applied, a CE is applied and the conformity Europini. C is conformity Europini, CE is applied and the device can be marketed throughout the Europe. Here you can see the risk classification of medical devices in the United States and Europe. According to USA, Class 1, Class 2 and Class 3. Class 1 means low risk of illness or injury. For example, gas and toothbrushes. Coming to Class 2, moderate risk of injury or illness. Example, sutures and needles. And finally, Class 3, significant risk of illness or injury. For example, pacemakers, implantable, defibrillators, etc. Coming to Class 1, low risk are sterile dressings and glove. Class 2A means low medium risk. Example, surgical blades, section equipment. Class 2B means medium to high risk, ventilators, some implants, radiotherapy equipment, etc. Finally, class 3 means drug-eluting cardiac stents, pacemakers, implantable defibrillators. They come under class 3 according to European Union. Now, let us discuss briefly about classes of FDA recalls and alerts. Class 1 recall, Class 2, Class 3, market withdrawal, and medical device safety alert. These are the various recalls. First of all, coming to Class 1 recall. Reasonable probability that the use or exposure to a device will result in serious adverse health consequences or death. For example, defective implantable defibrillator, critical labeling error on the drug. The next is Class 2 recall. Use or exposure may cause temporary or medically reversible adverse health consequence. Probability of serious adverse health consequence is remote. Example, a drug that is under strength but not used to treat a serious illness. Coming to Class 3 recall, use or exposure is unlikely to cause adverse health consequence. That is Class 3 recall. Examples are any recall that is unlikely to cause health effects but violates FDA labeling or manufacturing rules such as lack of English labeling on a retail food. The next is market withdrawal. Manufacturer initiated. The product has a minor violation that would not be subjected to FDA action. Manufacturer himself initiates the withdrawal. Example is routine updates and equipment adjustments and repairs. This differs from voluntary recall in that a recall involves a violation that would be subjected to FDA action. Marketed withdrawal does not require an FDA action, but voluntary recall may involve a violation that would be subjected to FDA action. And finally, medical device safety alert. Advisory that a medical device may present an unreasonable risk of the substantial harm. In some cases, some alerts are also considered as recalls. For example, notification to the public of a serious defect in an implantable defibrillator. These are the various recalls and alerts of the FDA. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for further videos on regulatory affairs and ICH guidance.